Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Welcome to Close to Leaguestart for patch 3.24. Today I wanted to go through a list of things that I think are all pretty solid League starters that you could play, including at least one outline of a build for every single Ascendancy. Now I do think it's worth noting, this is not a build guide to any of these. There's only going to be one POB upload, and that's something that looked like it was an interesting idea that got submitted to me when I was brainstorming for this. Instead, this is more going to be an index for builds. If you're an experienced build maker, then some of these might already be making you think this is how I'm going to scale it. If you're not an experienced build maker, there will be people playing all of these, and you'll be able to find information as to how to build any of these. Unfortunately, I can't do justice to more than one or two of these with full outlines and guides, because doing guides properly takes an enormous amount of work, and there's only a limited amount of hours in the day until League actually starts. Anyways, I want to start with a very, very important warning, and that is the Indigon Trap. Indigon is an item that is sometimes very important for builds to function, and it's an item that's been relatively easy to acquire on day 3 or 4 of a league in the past. It sometimes costs a little bit, but veteran players can easily get their hands on it. However, Gladiator Games have announced that in patch 3.24, the loot pool from each of the Pinnacle bosses is being split into 2 pools. One of these is going to the normal boss, one of them is going to the Uber version of that boss. It may well be that it's quite some time until the Uber Pinnacle boss loot is in circulation, and some items that presently are Pinnacle boss drops will now be Uber Pinnacle boss drops only. Now, I don't know which of these categories Indigon is in. We're not going to know until the patch actually goes live. I did a poll over on YouTube and asked my viewers whether they think it's more likely to go to Uber Elder or to the regular 1x Uber Elder, and there was a small majority that thought it was more likely to go with Uber Elder. But we flat out don't know. Indigon and mana builds have been hyped this league though, and if it does turn out that this is an Uber Elder item only, then it may mean that this is going to be very, very, very hard to trade for quite some period of time. It might be like Nimbus has been in previous leagues, or like the most in-demand Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels have been. So if you're planning a build that requires Indigon to function, then you better have a contingency plan so that you can farm at least 30-50 divines in case it ends up being that much. And if it turns out that it's not that much, well, that's fine. Bonus. You got a whole bunch of currency towards your next upgrade. The same also applies to Ashes of the Stars, Crystallized Omniscience, and potentially a bunch of other things we're not necessarily thinking of. So the short version of this, unless it's from Shaper, where GGG have announced which items are from Shaper, which are from Uber Shaper, but if it's from anywhere else, just assume that the item you want is coming from the Uber version of the fight, and that it won't be available and that it won't be cheap for a little while. Alright, all of that out of the way, let's go through all of the Ascendancies. I'm going to go through them in a fairly random order, but if you want to click to a specific Ascendancy, you can always use the chapters down in the description of the video. Let's start with the champion. Now, there's been a bit of interesting discussion over on the Path of Exile build subreddit around Spectral Shield Throw. There's something that looks like it's got some legs there, it's a starting point. I'll put a link to that down below. Just be aware this is definitely not solo self-found friendly, because the unique shield Emperor's Vigilance is so much better than every alternative for that build that it is just out of sight, eclipses everything else you could use, and that shield is rare. It's tier 2 rarity, so don't expect to find it in SSF. But if you are playing in SSF, maybe put Emperor's Vigilance on your loot filter to scream at you if it drops, and if it does drop, well, maybe you've got an idea for your second build. 2 other builds on the Champion Ascendancy that I'm willing to recommend. Firstly, there's Splitting Steel, which is recommended without caveat. Now we have the Corrupting Fever build. This has a huge caveat attached to it, and that is that this is one of the worst boss killing builds in the entire game. This is very much a one-trick pony. This is a build that doesn't die in maps generally. This is a build that just runs through maps exploding everything it sees really, really well. Then it comes to a boss that has 12 million hit points, which is standard for a tier 16 map boss. At this point, everything starts to slow down noticeably. Then it comes to a boss that has 35 million hit points, like the Guardian of the Phoenix, and at this point you start having a bad day. Then it comes to a boss that has 75 million hit points, like the Shaper, and your day goes from bad to miserable. This is the sort of build where you may very well want to consider engaging a boss carry service, because you're going to have a miserable time even with the Black Star and the Infinite Hunger, and it's going to be worse when it comes to the real Pinnacle bosses. That said, if you're okay with that weakness, this build has a lot of strengths too. As soon as you get the unique gloves Hemophilia, it becomes extremely, extremely good at clearing maps, and as a result, it's good at something, it's just not good at everything. Next we have the Gladiator Ascendancy, which is not a popular Ascendancy at all. And it's not a very good Ascendancy, but it's a little bit better than a lot of people give it credit for. There's some power here, it's just that bleed is in a marginal state at the moment. Very playable, but not uber. Split Arrow Bleed is the meta choice to play if you want to go a Gladiator. Now it's worth noting that Grinding Gear Games in one of their teaser videos teased Vile Split Arrow, but they didn't actually talk about it. It was just that they had it in their video that they were showcasing. It wasn't even used in the video, it's just that it was visibly equipped on the character. Now the patch notes don't mention Vile Split Arrow, so at the moment I don't think it's necessarily going to be in 3.24, but if it is, that's something that's worth considering using. But if they do decide that it is ready and they want to release it, then that could be something that's interesting. The other thing the Gladiator is quite good with is a Lacerate bleed build. And this is a build that has one particular unique weapon that no one else wants, which means that in a trade league it's usually pretty cheap, but that is incredibly solid on this build. That is Jack the Axe. Yes, that is the axe that talks to you. This axe is not unbeatable. You can get a rare item that's better than it. Just like you can get a rare item that's better than Cold Iron Point on physical spellcaster builds. The thing is that it's not something you can quickly get a better version of. As a result, it ends up being a pretty solid choice for a long period of time. The next Ascendancy to discuss is the Slayer. Now Boneshatter is a little bit worse than it was in 3.23, mostly because of the changes to Warcries. It's still fundamentally fine though. You smack things with a big axe, you leech through the backlash damage, and you leech through the damage that the enemies are doing to you. A couple of honourable mentions on the Slayer Ascendancy in case you're not a big fan of Boneshatter. Cyclone linked to Shockwave support has been a playable build for a long period of time. It's never really been an all-star, but it's been solid for a while. This tends to want to use an Eventuality Rod, which is an uncommon drop from Heist, but not a truly rare one. And if you want to be a bit more off meta than that, Static Strike is an option on the Slayer as well. Next we have the Assassin. We're getting a lot of the unpopular Ascendancies out of the way first. The Assassin is somewhat of a one-trick pony, maybe a two-trick pony early in the league. Icicle Mine Crit is something that a lot of people will level with and then get their 4 Void Stones with and then respec out of. This is a very good build on low investment, but it's something that's never really taken off, partly because it can be a bit uncomfortable to play mine builds, and also because there is a point where you no longer really want to be an assassin on it, and once you reach that point, it ends up being kind of awkward. You've got to do a big respec out of it. That said, it is definitely a solid starter. Viper Strike of the Mamba is a reasonably new skill. Now this is also going to be recommended on the Pathfinder. This is very much a poison build and it plays very differently to other poison skills. So definitely look around at guides for that. There was even a guide for it on the Path of Exile official website's Build of the Week section. Although that guide cannot be copied exactly as it required some items that only existed in patch 3.23, but it might give you some ideas to get you on the right track. And finally, Penance brand of Dissipation was broken in 3.23, like completely and utterly broken, so overpowered it wasn't funny. In 3.24, it's being nerfed a lot, but it should still be very playable on the Assassin as a critical strike-based character. Saboteur is next. Hexblast Mines is head and shoulder above all of the other options. You'll notice that most of the critical strike-based trap builds actually can go Saboteur, but generally choose not to. You can go Inquisitor on them, you can go Trickster on them, and it turns out that Trickster is the one that most people tend to favour. There's nothing wrong with going critical strike-based traps on a Saboteur now. It's still a very functional Ascendancy. It's just that it's not necessarily the best choice for what it used to be the only choice for. So now we're coming to the Trickster, and this is an incredibly versatile Ascendancy. It tends to be pretty good on most skills that deal instantaneous damage, i.e. not damage over time. It's functional as an Ascendancy for damage over time, but it tends to shine a little bit more on hit-based builds. I want to call out Frostblades as an example of a skill here that is something that works quite well on the Trickster, and that is one of the few melee skills that I would say is in a quite good spot in current day Path of Exile. Additionally, we were just talking about how Ascendancies other than Saboteur can be tempting to trap-based builds, and for that reason, I want to point out Explosive Trap with the Trickster. Now, I do think it's worth noting that Explosive Trap of Shrapnel received some changes in patch 3.24 that look like they are a buff, and in certain circumstances they are. What these changes do overall is they make it so that each individual piece of shrapnel that hits the boss does more damage than it used to, but that there is a larger percentage chance that any given piece of shrapnel ends up not connecting with the boss. In the limiting case of a boss that is so small that it is just 1 point, in that situation, which is the worst case scenario for the 3.24 version of the skill, you get something like 15% more damage, but each of the individual projectiles that you fire off goes from about 28% to hit the boss to about 19% to hit the boss. So you can see that that's actually a substantial decrease in overall performance. For that reason, I would be inclined to recommend that you use classic Explosive Trap for bossing. That said, for clearing, Explosive Trap of Shrapnel is better, and these are two gems that you can easily swap between even if you are using Replica Dragonfang's Flight to get +3 to the level of all explosive trap gems. Jumping over to the last of the 2 attribute aligned classes now, the Guardian Ascendancy is one that was one of the top starters for 3.23, but this is a build I do not recommend anymore. Summon Raging Spirit's instant application elemental damage was incredibly good in 3.23. It's been nerfed pretty hard. I don't think it's dead, but it is going to feel like it's one less gem link that you've got. Once you get to about gem level 13 or 14, we should be reasonably close to the point that you kill Kitava in Act 10. Up to that point, SRS should be fine, and honestly, it will still get you through white and yellow maps just fine, but it's going to start falling off in red tier maps. You're going to find that you're spending more time killing bosses than you were last league, and it's going to be quite a bit more. So let's put this in a category of skills that I'll say will function, but that I don't recommend. However, there is the Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow build. This uses Blink Arrow or Mirror Arrow of bombarding clones and can do tremendous damage. This is the version of Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow that cause your clones to fire rain of arrows instead of their usual skills. These do a lot of damage and they scale very well as your character gets more powerful, and in particular they scale extraordinarily well if you have an aura support character with you as well. Finally, melee skeleton builds on the Guardian are at least playable. They're probably now slightly better than Summon Raging Spirits, at least once you get to red tier maps, but we're not talking about something that's going to be shaking the game upside down. They're not going to be at the center of the meta, but they will just be functional. The Inquisitor is next because no one expects the Inquisition puns. This is the best Ascendancy for Righteous Fire since the changes that gem got in 3.23. Essentially, that was a severe nerf to it on Juggernaut, on Chieftain, and on Elementalist, but the Inquisitor came out of it just fine. Spark remains good, both the transfigured versions and the base version of it, and it gains quite a lot from getting back the tattoos that grant projectile speed. So these are going to be available, but no idea how rare or how expensive they'll be. Also, another option here is something that was sent to me by a viewer, and this is an Inquisitor Absolution of Inspiring build. Absolution of Inspiring is a version of Absolution that downplays the minion aspects in order to amp up the effect when you cast the skill yourself. And what I'll do is I'll put a link down in the description below to their build outline. This is definitely not a full build that you can just copy. I would only recommend this if you're a fairly experienced player that knows how to look at a path of building and say, alright, that's where it's going, now I'm going to work out a way to get there. The weapons present in that path of building are fairly hard to craft at that caliber, but it's not hard to get slightly worse than that using fossil crafting, and I do have a video on crafting +2 minion wands, which I'll put a link to down in the description below. That should still be accurate in 3.24, unless there's undocumented changes that nerf it. Hierophant is next, and this is likely to be the #1 pick on day 1. That has upsides and downsides. It means the very best gear that's crafted for Hierophants that are following meta builds will be very expensive, and in particular, things like fractured items that drop that fit this Ascendancy very well will end up being snaffled up really aggressively, and that means that they won't be available for you to craft your own gear as easily. On the flip side, there'll be plenty of things that people will make when they're trying to make a masterpiece for themselves that the crafter recognises are too good to roll over, but that at the same time are not what they're looking for, and that means there'll be a flood of this sort of gear on the market. Now with the Hierophant, effectively you pick one, Spell Totem support or Archmage support. Pick one of these, pick a skill that it works with that's not mechanically awful, and the combination should be pretty solid. Fair warning, the unique dual Rain of Splinters will be expensive early. The unique helmet Indigon, we've talked about already, that could be very hard to get your hands on all league. I also think Cloak of Defiance could also be expensive this league as well, so have a backup plan if you're going to go with one of these Hierophant builds. Make sure that you've got a plan that can survive on bad gear. Alright, that concludes our look at all of the dual attribute classes. We're going to look at the single attribute classes and throw the Ascendant somewhere in the middle there. Firstly, the Chieftain. This is something that is on my shortlist. So I'm thinking of playing a Hierophant build, and I'm also thinking of playing a Chieftain build. If I go Chieftain, it'll be very similar to the build I played in 3.22, which was something that was using Searing Bond and Righteous Fire to deal damage. However, Righteous Fire is downplayed in the build. It still works, it's still useful, we're still going to use it, but it's less central to the build. And we'll be using Fire Trap over Searing Bond, because Searing Bond, while it was functional, it was always somewhat of a hipster choice. Fire Trap just outperforms it a bit. So we'll be using a Fire Trap setup that is both scaling the damage over time ground the Fire Trap does, but that also scales the Ignite that the initial explosion of the Fire Trap deals. The good thing here is that most player stats that scale one of these scale the other. At the same time, we'll also be scaling the Hinekora explosions from the Chieftain Ascendancy. These are something that were really underrated when they came out. The 5% chance for monsters to go boom and deal 500% of their life as fire damage to surrounding enemies. It's not so much that killing those nearby enemies is the goal, it's setting them on fire and having them spread that flame to everyone else around them through the use of various ignite proliferation mechanics. That's the core of the build, and it is something that I may elaborate into a full guide. The other advantage here is that this is very, very well set up to then later on transition potentially into a fulcrum based build if you want to do that. You don't have to do that, you can stay with the fire trap setup, but if you're interested in transitioning over to a fulcrum build, you can definitely do that once the key items for that build become available. Sticking with the Marauder, of course, we'll go through the Juggernaut first. Juggernaut has been associated very strongly with Boneshatter recently, and just like with the Slayer, it's still a good skill despite the fact that some of the support cast around it has been nerfed. It's likely leagues ahead of other melee options. Now, Molten Strike of the Zenith is the other melee option that really stands out. This is probably actually the best melee skill in the game at the moment, but it's just not that well suited to a league start scenario because it attacks quite slowly. It requires you to stand your ground and attack 5 times in a row, which is not a trivial ask even on a Juggernaut very, very early in progression. Once your gear gets better though, it's definitely something you can consider respecing into, especially once you start getting a bit more attack speed, because while everyone associates the Juggernaut Ascendancy with armor, it is also very much an attack speed based Ascendancy as well, and that means that once you start getting rolling, you can definitely make Molten Strike of the Zenith work. I'm just a bit hesitant to recommend it until you're maybe level 88 or so, and you've got a couple of hundred chaos at least behind you. Finally, we've got the Berserker. Cleave of Rage took a nerf, but it still looks like it's got the goods, and it's probably the safe option for the Berserker Ascendancy. If you want something a bit spicier though, Glacial Hammer of Shattering has tremendous synergy with Merlin's Fallacy. This package then further synergizes with the Blitz charges that are part of the Berserker Ascendancy. So this is another way that you could consider playing this Ascendancy. Alright, let's get the Ascendant out of the way. I'm not recommending an Ascendant as a league start. Every other Ascendancy I've found something that I can recommend. Here, the only time I would recommend an Ascendant on league start is if you're in a static group, i.e. you're playing with friends and you play at roughly the same time, and you want to be a support character. You want to be an Aura bot. If that's you, fantastic, league start an Ascendant. The reason I don't recommend it is that a lot of the Ascendant's power budget is tied up in the fact that it's got access to a bunch of additional jewel slots, and at league start you don't own any really good jewels. So it means that there's a whole bunch of power that's sort of tied to the Ascendancy that you don't get for a while. Additionally, your first Labyrinth feels terrible on an Ascendant as well. You get so much less than everyone else gets. This is not to say that the Ascendant's in a terrible place come day 14 of the league, but on day 1, 2 and 3, I think you can do better elsewhere. Jumping over to the Witch, we've got the Necromancer first. Now, Summon Raging Spirit's in an interesting spot. We've already talked about how the instant application elemental damage versions of this skill that were popular for the Guardian got nerfed really badly. What's changed with the Necromancer though? Generally, once you take in all of the changes to the Necromancer Ascendancy, it looks like it's fine for Poison SRS, and it's a build that quite honestly, people who know more than me about minions are confident to recommend, and based on that, I'm confident to recommend it as well. The Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow shenanigans can be played around with on Necromancer as well, and they are looking very, very strong. Jumping over to the Elementalist Ascendancy, earlier I talked about the champion and said that there is a real one-trick pony with it. Here, the Elementalist has a very different type of one-trick pony. Detonate Dead is something that if you are experienced with the skill, if you know the mechanics of the skill well, you're experienced with how to min-max it, then it can be a very, very, very strong skill indeed. However, it requires quite a bit more game knowledge than a lot of other skills, and it requires quite a bit more messing around than other skills. It's also a playstyle that a lot of people don't like. If you want the best build in the league for killing very difficult bosses on dumpster tier gear, then Detonate Dead Elementalist is probably the answer for you. However, it's going to perform woefully if you make mistakes with it, and those mistakes are pretty easy to make. Honestly, I recommend that if you are intending to play Detonate Dead Ignite and you've never played it before, watch someone that's really experienced with it while they're doing test runs with it. That will give you a sense as to the playstyle and whether it's something that you can stomach or not. If you want a different style of Ignite that's really good at map clearing but that does struggle a bit more with bosses, Wave of Conviction Ignite is a good choice here. Wave of Conviction Ignite will outperform the champion-based physical damage over time builds when it comes to killing bosses, but it is still not a boss-killing skill. It can get the job done, it's just not great at it. Or alternately, you could go Explosive Arrow Ballistas, and that's something that is good at killing bosses, but that has the very annoying drawback of monsters dying behind you, which means that a lot of loot falls a screen and a half behind you. This anti-quality of life aspect is one of the reasons that a lot of people who appreciate the skill's power end up deciding not to play it again. Finally, you could go Critical Strike-based Lightning Conduit as well. Over on the Occultist Ascendancy, this is another one that I'm going to recommend against league starting. However, it's not going to be as hard a recommendation against it as I gave for the Ascendant. So basically, Occultist performs better mid-league than it does early on. It's very good once power charge stacking gear starts to become available on the market, and once you can afford that gear. Or if you're in solo self-found, once you start having some of the key pieces drop for you. It does work at Leaguestart, it's just not amazing at Leaguestart unless you're willing to play Hexblast Mines, and if you are willing to play Hexblast Mines, then the Occultist is one of the better starter choices for it. Jumping over to the Ranger class, we have 2 exceptional Ascendancies and 1 slightly less than exceptional Ascendancy. That said, Raider is in a really weird spot. It is, in my opinion, the best Ascendancy in the game for a period, and that is from about level 30 up to about level 85, maybe 88. After that, it starts to fall off, and it really starts to fall off. It's more that late game, everything else starts outscaling Raider. If you've ever used faster attack support on your main weapon skill during leveling, you'll have a sense of how it's really good early on, and then it starts to fall off really hard. And the reason it falls off so hard is that you're getting a lot of other sources of increased attack speed on the tree, and as a result, the increase that's provided by faster attack support ends up being a smaller and smaller component of your avalanching attack speed. The Raider has this problem with most of its scaling axes. In general, one of the best uses for the Raider Ascendancy is to level to 90, then respec to a better Ascendancy. You're the right class for 2 of them. Next you have the Pathfinder. This is versatile, it's powerful, there's a lot to discuss about it. The Resist Flask changes make this Ascendancy better at low gear investment and worse at high gear investment. If and when you get your hands on a Mage Blood, the 3.24 version of the Pathfinder is going to be worse than the 3.23 version was. However, until that point, until you've got the Mage Blood or a whole bunch of other wealth, Pathfinder is probably actually going to be better. Now, Viper Strike of the Mamba is a skill that we discussed earlier with the Assassin. The Pathfinder is probably its best home though. That's because the Pathfinder's Toxin node allows you to proliferate those poisons all through an entire pack, and that can be a very, very strong effect when you're dealing monstrous poisons with Viper Strike of the Mamba. The BAMA builds, the Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow builds, these can go Pathfinder, but this is going to be one of those builds where you're not going to get much power from your Ascendancy or from your passive tree for a while. You do have an inherently powerful gem, but where you will quickly get power if you're playing it on one of the other Ascendancies, the power is going to be a bit later on set. So do keep that in mind. Playing it on a Pathfinder has drawbacks early in progression, but they are things that you will make up. If you want a more traditional bow skill, Scourge Arrow of Menace and Caustic Arrow of Poison are both very good on the Pathfinder. They're going to be a bit worse than they were in 3.23, where Tinctures allowed all of your damage to poison, which meant that you could use a Tri-Elemental bow, which is a lot easier to craft than a more traditional poison bow. That said, these skills are good enough that they can work well in 3.24 as well. Just be aware that the unique bow Darkscorn, which would be something that might be on your radar as a really, really good early endgame weapon, this can be quite expensive. If there's any hype around Scourge Arrow of Menace or Caustic Arrow of Poison, then Darkscorn is going to be expensive, and it's not something you should count on getting your hands on. It's also a pretty rare unique. And finally, we've got the Deadeye. This thing's been meta for a while in softcore trade, and that's for good reason. It's been really, really good. Now, Tornado Shot's been significantly nerfed, and I'm just flat out not recommending it. People will force it to work. There will be people who manage to make this skill work, but it's not something that I would recommend early on. It's going to be a high investment build again, if it ends up being good at all. Moving over to Lightning Arrow, which was the other meta choice for Deadeye starter. Lightning Arrow is unchanged. Sniper's Mark has been nerfed, and that does make the build weaker, but it was so good in 3.23 that being a little bit worse is still fine. Also, if you're sick of the visual effects of Lightning Arrow but you like the playstyle, Ice Shot is similar, it's just a little bit worse. I'll add that with these skills, most of your damage against single targets is going to come either from Artillery Ballista, or alternately, if you don't want to use Artillery Ballista, there's a number of Mana Forged Arrows setups that will work as well. So do keep that in mind, you will need to have something to supplement for single target. And the final build I'll discuss here is the Deadeye Venom Gyre build. Hype around it has fallen off, but it's still a really good skill, so that's another option. Anyway, that's all I got for today. For all of the 19 Ascendancies, there's something there that I'm able to recommend for it, even if it is with massive caveats in the case of the Ascendant, and in many cases there's a few options. I'll leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.